watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. U.S. military officers made a surprise visit to Belarus this week to observe the Zapad 2025 exercises, part of Russia and Belarus's joint drills amid rising tensions on NATO's eastern flank. The exercises, which also involved observers from 23 other countries and feature advanced Russian missile systems, have sparked concern among NATO members and neighboring states. To discuss all this further, we're joined by Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer in Slavic and East European Studies at University College London. Thanks so much for joining us here on TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
The exercises are concluding today. It's to say the least, it was a tense time. What can we learn, and what's the takeaway here from these exercises that have now concluded?
Well, these exercises take place periodically. Obviously, the exercises this year were much smaller than they were last time because Russia has its troops occupied inside Ukraine with the war there. Otherwise, what we can learn is probably not much from the exercises themselves. They did not appear particularly impressive, nor were they intended to. I have seen some analysts suggesting that one reason a lot of the exercises were kept a bit under wraps was because perhaps Belarus and Russia don't want the West to see what they're trying to prepare for. But we sort of know the Russian-Belarusian war plans on this. I think what's more interesting is what you started your segment by saying, namely some of the observers that turned up, notably the American, but also, if I understand correctly, Turkish and Hungarian observers from NATO, plus a number of observers from the rest of the world. Now, that I think sends a signal which is probably the more lasting effect of these exercises, rather than what actually took place during them.
Yeah, and on those observers, in terms of, as we just stated, Americans, also to no surprise maybe from China as well, 23 different countries. So what is that signal that they're sending with all this and their presence?
Well, the signal that's being sent is that Russia and Belarus are to some extent acceptable to these countries. And I stress that because, of course, it's not surprising to any of us that China would say it can work with Russia, it can work with Belarus, it can accept their military activities. But it is problematic when NATO countries such as the US send the same signal. Now, of course, from the Russian side, this is very much emphasize this idea that we are respected, we are accepted around the world. We have people coming from all over the world to look at our very important exercises here. So it sort of becomes mutually reinforcing that, the different parties, the different observers, but also Russia and Belarus want business as usual between the countries to be, and between the militaries to be resumed as soon as possible. And that does seem quite concerning to me, not when we're talking about China, because that is to be expected, but when we're talking again about NATO observers at the exercises.
And Rasmus as well, let's not forget last week also very tense time as NATO forces, mostly in Polish airspace, downed those Russian drones. This has also raised tensions in this part. How secure, in your assessment, with these exercises now concluding, but how secure do you find NATO's eastern flank? I know we've had more commitments also. The Germans would send more patrols. We have more equipment coming here. But how secure are we at this point?
I think the only responsible answer I can give is that the eastern flank could always become more secure. It would always be beneficial, at least as things stand, for NATO to send more support that way. Having said that, however, it did seem to me that the reaction to the drone incursion over Poland was the correct one. There was slightly less focus on the incursions over Romania, but the same thing stands. I think that I like to hear the messages coming out from, well, certainly the European part of NATO and Canada, that we stand with, say, Poland, say, Romania, in any incursions. And obviously, the Polish and the Romanian forces would be quite capable as well. So the messaging was right. It is reasonably secure, the eastern flank for now, but more can and should certainly be done.
And what can be done more? Also, we talk about signaling a lot about what could be done next. Also with Russia, I know that the exercises were smaller in scale, but still they were highlighting these hypersonic weapons. There was a nuclear component. So what is now the counter for us in the West? What can NATO do now to make this all more secure?
Well, if we're looking at what NATO can do, and particularly perhaps the European part of NATO, plus perhaps Canada, a lot of it comes down to messaging to Russia and Belarus and China, certainly, but also messaging internally. It's about building up the story that NATO should be in this for the long term, that NATO is, for instance, rearming Europe, that European arms production is coming up, but also that European populations are being prepared for the fact that certainly Russia and most likely Belarus are not going to be responsible, not going to be predictable countries for a long time going forward. We're talking 5-10 years at least. And it's very important that NATO now sends out those messages to its populations and between the NATO countries that we must be ready in this for the long term. And then there are, as I mentioned a moment ago, the practical steps, such as, for instance, building up arms capacity, building up arms infrastructure, coordination, so on and so forth, training of soldiers. But the messaging is so important so we don't end up getting distracted by all the other stuff, all the domestic issues, which European countries, of course, have to look at too.
Yeah, I mean, NATO works only well if it's unified, but at the same time, a united signal, a united front in a way, but we have American observers in Belarus at the same time. President Trump last week wasn't very clear about his support of what NATO had done. So does this encourage, as we were saying, united message, united front, but does this in a way encourage maybe future incursions or anything that is happening with Zapad or anything similar?
Yeah, I mean, as I've indicated on previous appearances on your programs, I would not look to America for too much assistance here. I mean, we can certainly do deals with America to buy American weapons to some extent anyway, but I would particularly look at what the Europeans can do themselves, the European NATO members, possibly excluding Hungary. Now, there's nothing inherently new in that. I mean, for a long time, as you will know, as your viewers will know, the European NATO members have not done sufficiently in order to build up their armed forces. This has been a problem for decades. However, we are, as you were indicating now, we are in a situation now where America is becoming ever less reliable in NATO affairs. I don't think quite we're at the point yet where America is moving out of NATO, is suspending or removing its membership of NATO. But we do have to start considering that option. We certainly have to consider the option that the Trump administration is not ready to defend the eastern flank. We certainly can't depend on it. Therefore, European NATO members have to become more united under these circumstances. And
at the same time, I mean, as we talk about mixed signaling, mixed messaging as well, and a recent trip also from high-level U.S. representation in Minsk just a few days ago as well, those release of those Belarusian prisoners, but again, at also reducing and stopping sanctions on Belavia, right, this carrier for Belarus. How much is that give in to Lukashenko and Putin anyway?
Well, it's certainly giving in to them to some extent. There are two things we perhaps have to notice here. One of them is that Belarus, since you brought up the Belarusian case, now the Belarusian regime is very eager to try and get better relations with the West, so it doesn't continue its over-dependence on Russia. Whether it can succeed in that or not, the Belarusian regime, we shall have to see. In terms of what the Americans did, on the one hand, of course, it is very good that the hostages were released. On the other hand, we have to understand, as I've said before, that the American administration now thinks similarly to the Russian and to the Chinese administration insofar as the American administration sees the world as most productively divided between great powers, such as America, such as China, possibly Russia. America today, the American administration today, does not consider every sovereign state to have equal value, morally and practically. Europe has to stand up against that and say, no, actually, in Europe, we still believe in state sovereignty. We still believe in the fundamental equality of all sovereign states.
Okay. Just curious, because you did mention China. I'm curious about that as well. Wang Yi in Warsaw, also in the region. I mean, timing is also interesting at this point. We also hear that there was a productive meeting between the foreign minister of Poland, that Sikorski himself also likely at some point going to China. What do we make of this? Is there leverage here from Poland and Europe with China and then into Russia somehow?
Well, leverage might be pushing it a bit far, but certainly if we're talking about relations between European countries such as Poland and China, there are possibilities of deals. I mean, don't get me wrong. The Chinese government, the Chinese regime has no interest right now in stopping, or certainly no interest in pushing Russia to stop the war. Ideally, the Chinese would have preferred the war, certainly from 2022, not to break out. But since it broke out, China is not going to break with Russia over it. However, once the immediate fighting in Ukraine, for instance, stops, once the immediate threat to Europe, threat from Russia stops, China would very much like to continue being an investor in Europe, in Ukraine, in Poland, in other countries. And it doesn't want to tie its fortune so closely to Russia that it loses that opportunity for investment. So there is possibly the option to do some deals with China, but we have to be absolutely clear. The Chinese regime is largely on the side of the Russian worldview in this. Again, as I talked about before, with China, Russia and America looking at the world as rightly divided between great powers. So strategically, I don't think it's right to say, for instance, that we have the same interests as China, but it is possible that individual deals can be done.
Mm-hmm. So enough of, let's say, individual deals to sway policy here, or is that something that Poland and Europe can achieve?
Well, possibly to sway policy and to show the Chinese that they, again, should not get too bound up on Russia. It's one thing for Russia to isolate itself globally or largely isolate itself. It's another thing for China to do it. China doesn't want to do it. So, as with, say, America, if we can do deals with China, that's absolutely fine, as long as we don't overstate the wins we're going to get.
Mm-hmm. All right, so interesting, but also remains complicated for sure and will remain so in the near future. Really appreciate those insights. That was Rasmus Nilsson there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here as well. But stay tuned, much more coming up right here on TVP World, so don't go away. Goodbye.